And now our next speaker is a fellow by the name of Richard Barrett. He's the founder and chairman of the Barrett Value Center. He's also an author, speaker, and social commentator on, of all things, the evolution of human values in business and society. He also thinks of himself as a recognized thought leader on values, culture, leadership, and consciousness. Now, when I was talking to Richard last night, I sort of said, well, you know, you've got a long CV. There's a lot of things we could highlight about all the great things that you've done. Are there anything in particular that you'd like me to do to introduce you? And of course, being a Brit who has been over here for 24 years but recently gone back, he said in the way that only Brits could say, he said, well, when it comes time to introduce me, why don't you just say, here's Richard.
Hi, everybody. So we're going to be a little, pick up the tempo. We're going to be a little fast and furious. I'm going to show you a lot of slides. I usually do like 100 in 20 minutes. I'm kidding. But what you're going to see, I've already put up on slideshare.net, Barrett Values, slideshare.net. It's all downloadable, okay? So you don't have to take notes. All right, so let's get started. Will somebody tell me which button to press? There we go. All right, so the first thing I want to say is this. We need to recognize that business is a wholly owned subsidiary of society, and that society is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. You see, if we lose our environment, our life support systems and our society will perish, and so will our business. And that is a fundamental understanding which is now beginning to creep into large businesses all over the world. And it is the reason why, in my new book, which I'll be talking about in a minute, I have a whole paragraph as business as savior. Because I think the future for this planet is in the hands of business leaders, not politicians. They just haven't, they're not operating at the levels of consciousness that are necessary. So we need to look to our leaders of business to create the new future that we want. Now, I think that conscious capitalism is based on a new leadership paradigm. It's a shift from I to we, from what's in it for me to what's best for the common good, and from being the best in the world to the best for the world. That's a significant difference. So what are the tenets of conscious capitalism? We've been through them today. I won't spend too much time on them. Here they are. But what I would like to stress is, at the core of conscious capitalism are values. And I think it needs to be stressed. It's not stressed often enough. The leaders who are bringing conscious capitalism to this world are values driven. And I love this quote from Tom Peters, 1983. The real role of the leader is to manage the values of the corporation. That really speaks to me. So, how do you know if you're being successful at the tenets of conscious capitalism? Well, first of all, you need to measure the consciousness of the leaders. Secondly, you need to measure the consciousness of the organization as perceived by employees, and you need to do the same thing but as perceived by customers and society. So you say, well, wow, wait a minute, measure the consciousness? What does that mean? Well, I'm going to explain how to do that. We have two tools. We have several tools, actually. The one on the left here is called a cultural values assessment, and the one on the right there is called a leadership values assessment. Oh, I'm going to show you that result. That's from Darth Vader, just a little bit later. So we can actually measure culture, we can actually measure leadership from a consciousness perspective. I'm going to show you how to do that. And I'm going to talk about doing it by talking about the cultural transformation tools. I first developed the tools 15 years ago as I brought out Liberating the Corporate Soul, which actually, when I read it now, I brought it out in 1998, I read it like 14 years later, and I'm thinking, wow, that's conscious capitalism. I was writing about conscious capitalism. I didn't even know it. And then later in 2006, I brought out the book Building a Values-Driven Organization. And in these two books, you find the ideas around cultural transformation tools and how to measure consciousness in organizations. And more recently, in fact, the beginning of last year, the new leadership paradigm does the same thing for leaders. So what have we been doing? We've been accrediting consultants all over the world and change agents to use these tools, and now there's nearly 3,500 of them in 71 countries. 1.25 million employees all over the world have been part of these surveys, and we've actually surveyed something like 1,500 organizations in 69 different countries and nearly 900 leaders in 37 different countries. So measuring consciousness is out there. We've been doing it for a long time. I think what we do has been one of the best kept secrets that somehow we've managed to hang on to. And you needed to find us in order to use these tools, but it's becoming mainstream. So in Liberating the Corporate Soul, I talked about 3 mantras of performance. First mantra, cultural capital is the new frontier of competitive advantage. Who you are and what you stand for is vitally important. You have to focus on the vision, mission, and the values. We've had that already today. The culture of an organization is a reflection of leadership consciousness. Organizational transformations begins with the transformation of the leaders. A leader has to be committed to his own transformation if he wants to change the culture of an organization. These two are intimately linked. And thirdly, measurement matters. We know measurement matters. But if you can measure it, you can manage it. And what I'm proposing is that if we're able to measure and map values, then we can measure consciousness. And for the first time, we can make the evolution of consciousness conscious. Wow, that's never happened before in the whole history of Homo sapiens. To make the evolution of consciousness conscious? Just think about that for a moment. It's been totally haphazard up to this point in time. No wonder we're in a mess. So, how did I get started on this? Well, I first of all brought Maslow's work, the hierarchy of needs, together with Vedic philosophy. And Maslow talked about these deficiency needs. You don't gain any lasting sense of self-satisfaction if you meet these needs, but you feel anxious if they're not met. And this is where you get fearful about meeting these needs. So, for example, if you don't have a job, you're fearful about meeting your survival needs, basically. And these upper needs are called the growth needs. And when these needs are fulfilled, they don't go away. You want more and more of them. So these leaders who are doing conscious capitalism, guess what? They're into their growth needs. They've solved the problem of their deficiency needs. And John's just a great example of that. All he wants to do is change the world. He's like, oh, forget the rest. So I took Maslow's model and I shifted it from needs into consciousness. So I expanded the concept of self-actualization by reference to Vedic philosophy. I substituted states of consciousness for hierarchy of needs. And then what I realized, way back in 1996, I was writing Liberating the Corporate Soul, what I realized was that any value you care to name belongs to one of these 7 levels of consciousness. So Timothy, if I ask you your values, I can tell you what levels of consciousness you're operating from. Give me a value that's important to you. Love. He would pick that one that's all over the place. Love for family. Love for family. Level 2 consciousness. It's about relationships. I'll explain more in a moment. So here we are. These are the 7 levels of personal consciousness. Everybody needs financial security. They need safety. Everybody needs a sense of belonging and relationship. And you need a feeling of self-worth. Now, if you have any unmet needs at these levels, you show up with fear, and so at level 1, you'll get into control and greed. And if you have any unmet needs at the 2nd level of consciousness, then you'll get into blame and wanting to be liked. So these are limiting values. And then, as far as self-worth is concerned, we all want to have a positive sense of self-worth, but if we have any doubts about that, then we get into power and status. We've all met people who fight for the corner office or the parking space next to the front door. They're into status because at some level they have an unmet need of not being enough. At this first level of consciousness, survival, they have a fear of not having enough. Enron, greed, not having enough. At level 2, I'm not loved enough. At level 3, I'm not enough. And where do all these subconscious fear-based beliefs come from? They come from our childhood and early experiences. Because between the age of 0 and 7 or 8, we have a reptilian brain, we have a limbic brain, but we don't have the neocortex, the possibility to rationalize. And so we look for pleasure and we try to avoid pain through the limbic brain, which is an emotional brain. And all of the experiences we have during that period, we learn beliefs about how to be happy and how to avoid pain. And they stay with us for the rest of our lives. And so if you grow up in a dysfunctional family, then you grow up with some of these subconscious beliefs. And every family is dysfunctional to some extent. We all have these subconscious fear-based beliefs. Personal mastery is about how to overcome those beliefs so that you can not be controlled by those beliefs. And I'm losing my microphone here because I'm getting too agitated and too excited with what I'm talking about, which is usually the case. And now my ear is not cooperating with me. So we're having a running commentary on my technology issues. But I am totally unflustered by that. Well, if I let fear come in, then I would be worried about what you were thinking about me and my status and so level 3, I'd be worried about that. But since I didn't worry about it, I just sort of had a commentary about it. I'm okay at that level. So let's move on. We move on to the transformation level. This is the level where we begin to recognize that we have fears and we have the courage to face our fears and do it anyway, or learn to master those fear-based beliefs that keep coming up for us. At level 5, now having mastered those fears and recognize that we've met our deficiency needs, we're looking for something bigger in our lives, a sense of meaning and purpose. And this is where, in a sense, the first 3 levels are about the evolution of the ego, and then as we move into these next 2 levels, the ego blends with the soul, the passion, that part within you that is seeking meaning and seeking a life where you can now make a difference at level 6. Because that's what happens at level 6. You actualize your sense of meaning. And when you recognize that meaning and that actualization of meaning is important, you begin to collaborate with other people. That's the level of strategic alliances. And so that's where you begin to find partners and work with others, because you can maximize the impact on the world. And then finally, you enter this level of service, where you just want to be of service to the world because that's what brings you the greatest joy. Now, these 7 levels of personal consciousness, there are also 7 levels of organizational consciousness. And here we go. Beginning at level 1 is about financial stability. And this applies equally to a for-profit organization or any organization. You've got to have some money to pay the wages, basically. And if you're in an industry that like nuclear power, you better look after the safety of your employees. So these are the positive values that need to show up at these levels. At the second level, you want your employees to feel that they belong and that there are great relationships in the organization, sense of teamwork, things that we talked about earlier, and loyalty. And at level 3, we're looking for high performance. We're looking for systems and processes that work so well, we feel pride in who we are. Now, at these first 3 levels of consciousness, and this is really important, if you get too focused and have too much fear at these levels, what happens is fear creeps in. And you begin to get these limiting values showing up. At level 1, control and corruption and greed. At level 2, manipulation and blame. At level 3, bureaucracy and complacency. And at level 4, we begin now to say, aha, how can we transform that? This is the level of courage, innovation, and accountability. So what we've heard is that teams become accountable. So this is the level of giving people the opportunity to make decisions and be accountable for those decisions. It's also the level of continuous renewal and learning. Level 5, now we get into internal cohesion. This is the level where we have a shared vision, we have shared values, and we begin to build a sense of trust within our team and within the organization. And these are high-performing organizations. But if you want to take it to the next level, then you form strategic alliances with your suppliers and partners. And you deepen the sense of internal connectedness through mentoring and coaching. And finally, at level 7, you begin to realize that the organization operates within society. And if the organization wants to be successful, it has to help society to be successful. What we've been talking about. Now, higher is not better. We need to be able to operate at all of these levels of consciousness. And we encounter not-for-profit companies who are operating at those higher levels of consciousness, but simply haven't got a clue about systems and processes and making money in order to keep alive. So they're shooting themselves in the foot all the time because they're not full spectrum. We want to be full spectrum. So how does this work? Well, simply we ask 3 questions of all the employees and break it down by different demographics. And the first question is, pick 10 values that represent who you are. So from a list of about 80 words, you pick 10 values that represent who you are. Second question, pick 10 values that represent how your organization operates. Again, you pick 10 from a list of 80 and 90 words. And then pick 10 values that represent how you'd like your organization to operate. So we've got personal values, current culture, desired culture. Here's an example of the current culture. What you see up here are 100 people in this little organization. And every value, tradition got 59 votes. They said, well, our company focuses on tradition. It got 59 votes. Now, the little L, what does that mean? It's a potentially limiting value because tradition can block innovation. Then diversity got 54 votes. That's a level 4 value. Tradition is a level 1 value. You see where them showing up. Now, these white dots, what you see here, these are all these limiting values. So control, the third value there, is at level 1. It's a limiting level 1 value. Image is a limiting level 3 value. Now, an interesting thing is that this template of values that we use in order to people to pick values from is customized for every organization and every culture. What we have found is, for example, in South America, image is not a potentially limiting value. It's a positive value everywhere. Whereas in the Western world, if it's all about, look at me, shall I walk by again? That's image. It's a limiting value. It's like, what's behind all of this stuff, So we customize not only the list of values, but also the sign that a value can have, positive or limiting. So now here comes something really significant. So that was 100 people, and they all had 10 votes, and those were the top 10 values. Now, if we look at all of the 100 people with their 10 votes, that's 1,000 votes, and we look at how many votes were for positive values and how many were for limiting values, we get to a measure called cultural entropy. Turns out cultural entropy is one of the key numbers to look for when you first get the results back. Cultural entropy occurs at these first 3 levels of consciousness where the fears of the ego get into the way of the running of the organization and the fears of the leaders, so the leaders are dysfunctional. So, we've got the 3 questions: personal values, current culture, desired culture, and here's an example. So on the left-hand side, what you see is a company of 339 people. These are the top 10 personal values. In the middle, you see the top 10 current culture values. And on the right-hand side, the top 10 desired cultural values. And what we begin to see is that in this case, there's only one matching value between the personal values and the current culture. It's accountability. It's the one that's underlined. As far as the matching values between the current culture and the desired culture, we've got 4 of them: continuous improvement, customer satisfaction, teamwork, and accountability. But those limiting values are showing up there. Those are the values with the little L's behind them, you've got blame, inconsistent, and job insecurity. Now, right now, as you begin to look at this, you begin to have a roadmap to the future. You've got the current culture, you've got the problems there, and you've got the desired culture. So, here are all of the votes for all of the values. And so what you see here is cultural entropy at 23%. Now, that's relatively elevated. So here's an example. It happens to be our own organization. We measure ourselves every year, where we've got 4 matching values between our personal and current, and 6 between our current and desired. Our current level of entropy is 3%. There is a direct inverse relationship between cultural entropy and staff engagement. We've measured it. We've done it, hundreds of surveys to map that linkage. And so high entropy, low engagement. Low entropy, high engagement. I'll skip that for the moment, but here's another output. If we look at the top scoring values in the current culture and the desired culture, we can see the value jumps. In other words, the current culture, teamwork got 4 votes in this team, desired culture, 10 votes. So the values jump is 6 for teamwork. Again, this gives us the opportunity to focus on what's working and not working. And we know teamwork is something that is really important here because it's the biggest values jump. So these are the different levels of cultural entropy. 0 to 10% is healthy, 11 to 20% minor issues, 21 to 30% significant issues. And as we move into these higher levels of entropy, guess what the problem is? The problem is leadership. Because the personal entropy of the leaders translates into the cultural entropy of the organization. So when you pull this data out by business unit, by department, and all of the details, you can see pockets of high entropy. And you know immediately that those groups are potentially the ones with leaders who've got high personal entropy. And that's the moment where you can go in precisely like a surgeon and deal with that. Not cut that person out, but say, okay, you know, your entropy in your unit is much higher than everybody else. It's lifting the overall level of cultural entropy. What is it that you need to do in order to improve your leadership style? So here's some data from over 1,000 organizations that we've looked at over the past, or we've measured over the past few years. And what we have found is that most of the entropy is around 11 to 20%. And then as you 21 to 30%, it begins to decrease. There are not too many organizations above 41%. And the reason for that is, when you get to that level of entropy, there is so much energy going into blame, internal competition, etc. They go out of business. So when I went to Iceland, we mapped the values of Iceland. We're actually doing this in nations now. I'll mention that in a minute. In 2008, in August, the level of cultural entropy in Iceland was like 54%. And they had very few matching values between the current and desired culture. And I thought, wow, there's a real issue of leadership here. I got there with my colleague Ashley, and I was on TV that night, and I thought, gosh, what am I going to say? And I said, if Iceland was an organization, you'd probably be going bankrupt about now. That was in September the 6th. 2 weeks later, the banks in Iceland went bankrupt. So,
give up on that and try this.
Okay, that's a beautiful idea. Thank you very much. There is a discrepancy here. Here I've got 7 minutes, and you're telling me 1 minute, so I'm not quite sure what's going on, but I'm going to go with the 7. So, this is what the top 10 values look like for 0 to 10% entropy on the left-hand side. And if you look at the right-hand side, the above 41%, you see all of those limiting values showing on. So we want to be at this end of the scale. So not only can we use this tool to measure the values of employees, we can go to our customers and say, what are your personal values? What values do you see in our organization? What values would you like to see? So we did that in our own organization recently, and this is what we saw, which is a really good result, because between the current culture that they saw in our organization and the desired culture, there were 5 matching values. But what was so interesting was, in the desired culture that people saw for our company, they wanted more strategic alliances and more innovation. Right, that's where we're going. That's the next thing to focus on. So here you have a roadmap year by year. And so what happens is, companies, once they start using this tool, they use it every year to map their culture. So a quick word about leadership values assessment. Now, this is simply a feedback tool where I pick out 10 values about how I operate, and then I invite 10 to 15 people to pick out 10 values about how they think I operate, and we compare the results. Now, what we have found is that here, this is on the left-hand side, this is the current culture of an organization with entropy 38%, which is quite high. And now we look at the personal entropy of the leader, 64%. So no wonder we have a terrible culture. And here's just the opposite. Cultural entropy in the organization is 7%, personal entropy of the leader, 9%. This is the link between who you are as a leader and the culture that you create. We've been measuring it. Now, I'll skip the bit on whole system change because I'm running out of time. And I just talk about, this is the result of a leadership values assessment. So on the left-hand side, you see Jeff's values that he thinks, that he operates with. And on the right-hand side, you get the feedback from, I think, 11 people. Oh, a certain number of people. And what you see here immediately is who Jeff is seen exactly by how people see them. There's a match. You can just see it right away from the diagram. Whereas, if you look at the next one, Jim sees himself quite in a little bit lower down in terms of consciousness, but the people he works with see him exactly the same as they saw the previous person. Whereas the leader of the organization, and this is a real example, I just changed the names, Darth Vader, you know, he's ambitious, courage, creative, excellent, integrity, long-term perspective, passion, results, strategic vision. Man, this is what you want to start an organization. But how good is Darth at managing his people? Take a look. See the white dots? You know, authoritarian, competitive, demanding, power. So here you immediately get feedback. Usually this forms like a 2 or 3 hour coaching session with the leader, helping them to overcome what these difficulties are. And so we've got different levels of personal entropy here. Now I'm down to 4 minutes, and that's okay, because I'm not going to talk too much about whole system change. Anybody who's familiar with Ken Wilber's work knows about that human systems can be broken down into 4 quadrants: the interior of the individual, the exterior, and the interior of the collective, and the exterior of the collective. And in the interior, we have our values and beliefs, and in the exterior, we have our behaviors. And so when the leader's values change, the behaviors change of the leaders. And when the leaders' behaviors change, that sends a signal to the culture, the values of the organization change, and the behaviors of the organization change. So whole system change, if you want to change the culture, you've got to start with the leaders and their personal alignment, their authenticity, the walking the talk. The values, they have to live the values that they talk about. And at the bottom there, you've got structural alignment. These are the espoused values of the organization measured against the values that actually show up. And if they're not in alignment, you've got a problem of structural alignment. And on the left-hand side, do my values align with the values of the organization? That's values alignment. And on the right-hand side, we have mission alignment, which is do I think the organization is on the right track? And we get the data from the CVO, the Cultural Values Assessment, gives us information on this right away. So I want to just finish up by saying, recently we've been mapping the values of nations. And these are the nations where we've actually mapped the values, the personal values, the current culture, and the desired culture. And over on the right-hand side, these are the countries where we're getting requests to map the values of the nations. So we're taking this technique and applying it to nations. Now, we know how to do cultural transformation in organizations using this tool as a starting point for new conversations that didn't happen before. And what we're experimenting with, how do you transform the cultures of nations? Wow, there's a group of us that have been meeting now for 3 years, the people who are sponsoring these assessments, and we meet every year to discuss what progress we're making, and we're learning by doing. It's difficult to get the attention of the governments in some cases it's not so difficult. And so my vision is that we can transform not only our organizations, we can transform our nations too. And here, on the left-hand side, is the book I'll be bringing out in about 4 or 5 weeks called Love, Fear, and the Destiny of Nations, the impact of the evolution of human consciousness on world affairs, where I talk about what is necessary for us to live in that world we all want to live in, that world that conscious capitalism represents. And I've got a little section in there about business as savior, because I believe business is the way to the future, because we've got the most enlightened people in business. They're not in politics. And the more powerful our business leaders become, the better. The conscious capitalists, the more powerful we become, the more we will create and get the attention of our politicians. Volume 2 of this book, which will be out next year, looks at the 15 nations where we've done detailed analysis, and for each nation there will be a whole chapter on the values that we measured and on what's going on in that nation. Because so often in Latvia, for example, we measured cultural entropy at about 52%. Within a few months, the government fell and changed. In Iceland, it happened like 2 or 3 weeks later. It's not that we do a cultural assessment in a nation and immediately we cause the nation to go bankrupt. No. It's just happened that we've actually been on hand when that's and recently, it was so interesting, we mapped the values of France just about 2 months ago before the elections, and it's the highest level of cultural entropy we've seen in any of our nations. I could have told you that President Sarkozy would not make it. It was so obvious. And people are leaving France. People are leaving France because of the culture. So, the US is absolutely a mess. We've measured it 3 years running. And if you go to our website, you can see all that data. It's out there for public display. And the cultural entropy in the US is like 52 to 54 to 56% every year. You are really conflicted. The nation is conflicted. And the issue, one of the biggest issues, is inequality. And it's getting worse. That's what all this book, the Love, Fear, this is what this book is about, Love, Fear, and the Destinations. It gets into those details, and I spend a lot of time in this first volume looking at the US, UK, and Sweden, because they're very contrasting examples. So this tool gives us the ability to make the evolution of consciousness conscious. I've got an example here of Nedbank. I've run out of time, where they started off with entropy at 24%. And after 7 years, they're now down to 10%. And every other indicator of performance has gone through the roof. Because as you pull down the entropy, engagement goes up, profits go up, and everything else goes up. So that's it, folks. You know, half an hour was a bit of a challenge. Sorry about that. But we're running over time, and actually, I've still got 2 minutes left.
Well, thank you, Richard, for opening our eyes about how to measure some things around consciousness. And just as a quick anecdote, I got married last summer in Iceland for the second time. And I have to say, it was a fascinating dialogue with some of the Icelandic people, because they really have, in the last 18, 24 months, thought long and hard about the values of the country, and a big, strong movement to go back to the basic values of Iceland. You know, we're a small island. We don't have a lot of resources. We raise sheep. We've got some geothermal stuff, but you know, we're Vikings, and we have to go back to our Viking values and get away from the easy money banking and real estate disasters they went through. And it was fascinating to have that active discussion. And then you have bring this up and sort of say, yeah, I mean, if you went back to Iceland today, it would be fascinating to see how that may have changed.